And welcome to the Mailbox, the weekly show where I go through your comments and discuss them in a little bit more detail for some of the more interesting ones. And this week there's a fair amount on, Battle for Azeroth, past, present and future, including 8.1, as well as Classic WoW, of course. Hi, so we like to do the where's the mailbox at the start. You just have to be able to say where the mailbox is, which zone and which specific place within that zone. And this was last week's, and it was indeed the Obsidian Sanctum, which was in Dragonblight, or the Obsidian Dragon Shrine there, whatever. So we'll have this week's as well. What you have to do is be able to say where specifically is and which zone it's in as well, because the place I'm in has a name. It shouldn't be too difficult. For those who got this easily enough, then this one won't be any more difficult either. So let's get on to the comments. Where's the first one? Here it is. It's on war mode. So I'll just read the comment out first. It says, well, let's say I will get some extra rewards for turning war mode on, like bonus XP and reputation, but end up most of the time dead by the overwhelming horde presence, even if it is my faction territory, or I will let war mode turned off. No extras, but peace and quiet, and especially no frustration with the horde. Guess the choice is clear. So this is about, Blizzard identified that war mode is a bit crap for Alliance, by and large, especially if you're just out and about doing your own thing, and you just want to benefit from the rewards. I mean, a lot of people, queried at the before BFA came out, why the rewards were as they are. I mean, when it comes to things like this, which is effectively what Blizzard are trying to do with these rewards, is not. They say it's to reward people for potentially lost time when they're out in the world doing other things. Okay, which in theory it does try and compensate that a little bit. But what it's ultimately about is getting people to do world PvP, as it might be called, or war mode is actually a better way of describing it, that wouldn't ordinarily do it, and that's where I have a big issue. I think people should be allowed to do the content they want to do. Some people enjoy all the content, all that there is on offer in World of Warcraft. Some people don't. I mean, what I wanted to do up until this expansion was basically raid. I enjoyed the leveling. I like that. Sometimes there was the odd other little event or something like that I also enjoyed. Mythic Plus dungeons were enjoyable as long as I got away with just doing a few of them. But ultimately what I wanted to do was endgame raiding, hard mode raiding, mythic raiding as it ended up becoming. So I always resented it when, as part of that, I had to do other things, which sometimes included PvP. And in BFA, if I'd have still carried on mythic raiding in BFA, I would have had to have done PvP, because early on, you had to. Some of the rewards were very good. I'd have been compelled to do it. I probably wouldn't have to be still doing it now, but I would have been compelled to do it for a while, especially at the start when I had loads of other things to do as well. I wouldn't have liked that at all. This is the other way around. It's like it's giving you PvE bonuses for doing PvP content, and I like the way that you get the gear in with the war mode, and I like the idea of the bar. I think a lot of the features of war mode are actually very, very good for people who want to engage in it. But your downside is always, if you're compelling people who really don't like that world PvP to do it, then you're just giving them a hard time. And the problem is that what's happened, they've identified that, Alliance are having a really tough time of it, because not enough of them are all that bothered. And the reason for this is, of course, if you look at the more serious players within World of Warcraft, the vast majority are Horde. They are just... They've even admitted that now. We always knew this anyway, but Blizzard have actually now said this. In PvE and PvP, it's Horde. So, but if you look at the overall, number of characters, it looks a bit more balanced. But that's because, a lot of those Alliance characters are played by either very casual people or really, really casual. And I mean so casual they don't even get to level cap. So they don't really affect war mode because they're not going to put war mode on. So the end result was you had almost nobody on the Alliance side, relatively speaking, putting war mode on, and quite a lot of Horde players putting it on. So it's completely imbalanced. Now, they've tried to address this by upping the rewards for whichever faction, because at the moment the rewards are for everyone. Everyone gets them equally. It's just a reward for putting war mode on. But they're going to change it so that you get extra rewards if you are the underdog faction, which of course is Alliance. But the problem is, like this person is alluding to here, and this is exactly what I said during the beta process, that it's not a compensation if you're just spending all your time dead. If the reality is you're just doing what used to happen on a PvP realm, you're going around, you're leveling maybe on an alt or something like that, and every now and then someone comes along and kills you. Maybe they're in that area, so you have to get your corpse back really quickly and go and quest elsewhere. That's annoying. I didn't like that at all. But if that's the worst of it, then the rewards would compensate for that. But if you're just everywhere you go, there are like death squads going around killing everyone, murdering everyone, then it's not a compensation, because if you've gone out there to quest to level up, you're not getting that done. You're not able to do that. If you're going out to get world quests done, if a set of world quests, however many you want to do, let's say it takes about half an hour normally. If you didn't have war mode on, it would take half an hour. Let's say with war mode on, it's so bad that it takes you 2 hours. It's not compensating you. There is no compensation. The only way I would suggest Alliance can get away with having war mode on, I mean, I don't know, but people have sort of said this as well, at peak times, is if they're in a group going out specifically to do the war mode content. In other words, killing enemy players. That's the only way of having war mode on and getting any benefit, as far as I can tell. So Blizzard's idea of just upping those rewards. Now, here's what it's supposed to be based on. It's supposed to be based on the idea that a lot of Alliance players will go, ooh, that's more rewards. Yeah, all right, I'll try putting war mode on. The problem is that everyone is going to think exactly as this post, which I would as well, which is to think, well, it might be all right if loads of other Alliance players all of a sudden decided to go with it. But they'll just think of it as, well, maybe I would decide to, and hardly anyone else would. We'd still have the same problems. Because even if you doubled the number of Alliance players with war mode on, ooh, gone blurry, then that still doesn't deal with the issue. You would still be overwhelmingly outnumbered. So that's not going to fix it. I don't know how they can fix it, to be fair. This isn't one of those situations where I'm thinking, they're applying the wrong solution to a problem. I actually don't know that there is a solution to this particular problem. The problem ultimately stems from the fact that they allowed, years ago, an imbalance of the factions. And it's so important that you maintain balance with factions. And I think why they let it drag on for so long is because World of Warcraft is essentially a PvE game. And they just thought to themselves, well, it doesn't matter in PvE, does it? It does actually matter in PvE. But you can't help but notice it in PvP. If I draw a parallel, for example, with Warhammer Online, which was for PvP was very good, but it was a failure of a game on balance. Because it was PvP orientated, they had to maintain faction balance. Had to. And that was ultimately its downfall, because it wasn't able to do it. What would happen is you had two factions, Order and Destruction they were called. And you'd get some servers that would naturally, as soon as one server had a significantly larger number of players than the other, then because it was all based on PvP and world PvP mostly, there was instant stuff as well, but the world PvP was the best stuff. That faction would have an advantage over the other. And that would mean that the other faction then would constantly be the underdogs. They don't want to be the underdogs. So, they'd either, if they wanted to be that faction, go on to another realm, or just, go to that faction. However it would work out, you ended up with servers becoming overwhelmingly Order or overwhelmingly Destruction. So what did the game's developers do about this? They merged those servers. Get a high pop Destruction server, high pop Order server, put those together. But it had the effect of constantly merging servers down and down and down and down. You can't keep doing that forever, and they couldn't. But that's an example of a game where it was super obvious super quickly. Because in a PvP-based game, it becomes frighteningly obvious whenever you've got a bit of an imbalance. And that's what's happening here. You cannot have an imbalance. And the imbalance is so acute I just don't think there's very much they can do about it, unless someone's going to have a cunning plan. But that cunning plan is not going to be increasing PvE rewards. Because if people want to do PvE, if people want to go out and do world quests, if they're Alliance, they should absolutely put war mode off. Because it's just not worth it for the time you've got. Unless you can literally play it like 18 hours a day, and it doesn't matter if everything takes you 3 or 4 times as long. Because at the end of it, if you're going to do all the content anyway, it would end up getting you more Azeroth power and stuff like that, I guess. Or the resources, whatever you're after. But if you've got a limited amount of time to play, it's not worth it. And that's, again, the majority of the players. The majority of the players just play for a few hours a day, maybe. And that might put war mode on. And I just don't see how it's going to incentivize them to do it. I really don't. But we will see. We will see. Maybe I'm wrong. So, next one. All right, classic WoW one. It says, should we use Dragon Kill points, the old DKP? It says, yes or no. The thing is, there are no websites for that in modern WoW, so making a raid guild with all that stuff will be hard. I'm not so sure about that. I do think they would use DKP in classic WoW. Now, if we think about... So I'll just explain briefly how DKP was for people who don't know. Different guilds enacted it in different ways, but essentially it took the following form. These were points, like a currency, but within the guild. And you got them for completing certain tasks. For at the most basic level, you would get a certain amount of DKP for being in a raid, for actually raiding. And then when loot dropped, it cost you DKP. Now, there were different systems of awarding it. So I'll go through a couple that I had come across. The first one was the straight up cost. So let's say an item dropped and 5 people wanted it. So you'd say, right, this item's dropped, whisper me if you want it. 5 people whisper them. And all they do is they look up on the DKP table who out of those 5 has the most DKP in the guild. And then they give it to them and charge them that amount of DKP. So if it costs 50 DKP, they take 50 DKP off their total and they get the item and everyone rolls merrily on. The other way was the bidding system. Now, the bidding system was better in a way, but it also had its disadvantages. So what would happen here is you would usually want to do this with a program, but sometimes guilds didn't have that, so they'd have to come up with some other system. But what would happen is you would say, right, this item's dropped, bid DKP, and if it had to be done without an add-on or anything like that, you'd whisper it in game, whisper it to the loot master. What are you willing to bid on it? And you'd put the highest amount you're willing to pay for it, and then whoever bid the most would get it. But again, depends on, they'd usually, to be fair, get it for the amount of DKP, not the amount of DKP they bid, but the amount of DKP bid by the second highest bidder, if you see what I mean. So let's say out of 2 people, one of them said, well, I'd pay 100 DKP for that, and the other one said, well, I'd pay 90 DKP for that. The one who was willing to pay 100 DKP would get it, but they'd get it for 90 DKP. Now, pros and cons of this. Pros, it sort of meant that people who wanted it the most would get the item. So people would make an assessment. Because the problem with DKP is there was an inflation within it, which was very difficult to manage. And most guilds didn't bother managing it at all. Because what would happen is if you've got someone who's in the guild for a long time, they're going to be acquiring DKP, they get items, and then they're going to go for a long time not needing upgrades. You don't get upgrades very often in classic WoW systems because each boss only drops a few items and there's like 40 of you in the guild. The bosses in vanilla generally dropped fewer items than the bosses now in Mythic. But you had twice as many people. So obviously, you weren't getting upgrades a lot compared to now. So you'd be building up your DKP for a while, and then some people would leave and take their DKP with them because they'd leave the guild. And you get some people, if the inflation wasn't tackled, some people with so much DKP, they could just bid on anything. They'll just get us anything. And the problem then is they're bidding on items that they'll think to themselves, maybe I'll use it on a fight or two, and it might be a minor upgrade or just a side grade, and they're depriving someone who would have actually had masses of use out of it. But maybe they wouldn't bid loads on it. So, yeah, so the bidding system was better from that point of view. However, it was also a disadvantage because if you were cunning, I was always cunning with my DKP. I was always... when I joined a game, it didn't take me that long to get top of DKP and basically get first dibs on everything. And the way I did this was a couple of ways. First of all, I didn't bid on anything that was just very minor. I was very clear about what was a good upgrade for me. And I used to think to myself, right, I'm not going to bid a lot on this unless it's something I'm going to keep for several months. So whereas some people would just bid on any old crap and they'd spend their DKP, they might buy 3 or 4 different weapons a tier. Well, that's stupid. Just pick the weapon that's best for you and wait for that is what I used to do. And that meant I didn't waste a load of DKP on crap that I replaced very quickly. But then with bidding as well, there was another little dirty trick. It's like playing poker, really. I'm not saying I'm a good poker player, but it was like playing poker. You'd think to yourself, let's say an item dropped and you knew it was fairly desirable. You knew at least there'd be one other rival for it. And if I thought to myself, because what I would do, I would think to myself, I wonder what that person is prepared to bid for it. And I would probably bid a little bit under what I thought they would bid for it. So let's say something dropped. Let's say an item dropped and I knew that player A desperately wanted it. And I knew they had 200 DKP. And I suspected they would bid everything for this item. They want it so badly. But it's also a decent upgrade for me. But I can wait. What I would do is I'd probably bid something like 180 DKP. Knowing that they'll bid everything. And they would win it. But they would have to pay 180 DKP for it. And then maybe the next time it drops, no one else wanted it but me. I'll get it for like 10. So you could use things like that to basically make your DKP rivals spend way more points than they otherwise should, just because I know how much they value it. And then I wait to get it second or whatever and pay way less. And again, helps you keep at the top. So there's all sorts of cunning, and those are very much disadvantages with it, you can see, because anyone playing the system, anyone who's cunning, will always get the best out of it. But that being said, the reason DKP was later abandoned was, yes, those disadvantages became more and more obvious, but the advantages disappeared. So what are the advantages to DKP? Well, like I already alluded to, you're talking about doing raid bosses that drop 3 or 4 items for 40 people. Loot Council is not viable in a situation like that, especially if an item drops that's useful for half of that raid, okay, which is possible. So you might have an item drop that's useful caster item, but it could be useful equally for caster DPS or healers. And that could be, that could be more than half your raid. And to loot counselling something to decide who between 3 or 4 people should get it is one thing. Between 20 to 30 people is entirely another. Sorry, excuse me. So it's much better, and it causes way less drama just to have a DKP system, and then it's down to the system. It's fair for everyone. No one is making what might appear to some to be a subjective decision, and it largely might be a subjective decision. You're leaving it down to the DKP. But you do have to manage inflation. And what I would suggest in terms of addressing the fact there's no websites that support it, I think people would, people could come up with add-ons very, very quickly. I think people would come up with add-ons to help deal with it. Because there were add-ons later on anyway. There were, especially for the bidding DKP system, there were very, very good add-ons. And you would just use something like that. But Loot Council, some people may try if they've never experienced doing vanilla WoW, or maybe they have and they just think that the reason DKP died is because better systems were developed. It wasn't better systems. It was because the loot system changed. The way looting works completely changed. We effectively now get 2 or 3 times as much loot per person in the game than we did then. So I think it should have it. I think it will be feasible. There you go. So let's have a look. I could have done a whole video just on that, couldn't I? Right, next one. There's a few little comments in here, but they are quite common. They are quite common little issues that people come up with on forums and comments and various. So it says, sadly, nothing short of a new expansion will spark any renewed interest, and that's if they're very lucky. See, the thing is, I think part of their business strategy is exactly that. They know that most people who buy the expansion are not going to carry on playing it for any length of time. They seem to be okay with that. Like, from a business point of view, there's nothing wrong with it either. It makes perfect sense because although we know that obviously they make more money if they can retain us as subscribers, the expansions cost as much as an actual game, right? And they don't spend more on development resources than a new game would cost. So from their point of view, they're just thinking about it. Well, the expansion is like a new game. People will buy the expansion. If they don't pay for any subscription on top of that, beyond the first month, all right. Well, we've got their money for the expansion. It's more than paid for the expansion. All they need to do is hype the hell out of it. They just have to make sure that they've hyped the hell out of it. And they go through the same bloody cycle that's tried and tested. As they begin hyping it up, they start to acknowledge all the things that we didn't like about the current expansion as they're hyping up the next one. And they say, yeah, we've learned from this and we're going to do this and this and this. They did that for this one, many of which were lies, right? Now, for the longest time, I was thinking to myself, it's probably harsh me calling them lies. What they may have just done is been genuinely honest that they were going to do these things and then just change their mind. Because I also know that they do change their minds a lot. But the problem is that it keeps happening. And once it's happened for a few cycles, you begin to think it can't just be changing their mind all the time. They've got to be just saying whatever they think we want to hear. All right. And then as the alpha and beta process, and then they start to rein it in as it goes on. But by then, the aim with the pre-orders is get us to buy the pre-orders, and so they've got the money in the bank, and then it's done. And give out rewards and stuff like that, so that we'll actually use it. In this case, it was Allied Races. I would be amazed if there were not something very similar for the next one as well. Not necessarily Allied Races, could be something else that makes us want to pre-order it 6 months in advance. It was more than that, wasn't it? Was it about 7 or 8 months? Came out in August and they did the pre-orders in January, didn't they? So yeah, about 7 months. It wouldn't surprise me if they do the same again. But I do now see a cycle which is acknowledging all the things that they defended. They've defended things for 2 years, then all of a sudden go, oh yeah, actually, yeah, we now agree with you, and we're going to do this in the next expansion. And then they hype it up in other ways as well, exciting storyline, cinematics, pre-order bonuses, whatever. They hype it up in as many ways as they can think of, promise the moon, and then the thing releases. A load of people get disenchanted with it. They try and retain as many subscribers as they can, of course, because obviously, you only have to subscribe for 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months, and you've paid another game again's worth of money. So they'll try and retain as many as possible, of course. And if they suddenly lose a load of them, yes, they're going to worry about that. But they've got enough, And I know in business, there's no such, from the shareholders' point of view, there's no such thing as enough. But they have. You've got enough to make a fairly hefty profit, and they can keep doing the same thing over and over again. And if for the next, I'll tell you what, for the next expansion, if they manage to hype it up and sell as many units of the next expansion as they have for the last 2, even though, or the last 3, I could even say. The last 3. Because WOD sold a right load as well, remember. If they do that, then they'll have proven that it works. That we're all suckers. Anyway, so many promises, so many lies, yes. Disappointment as a result of this expansion feeling the worst thanks to the 2 biggest culprits, Azeroth system and GCD. I mean, the GCD, well, I'll read the whole thing out anyway. It says, they seem incapable of making the Azeroth system worth the grind, and even with their supposed improvements, it's still going to be garbage, not feel worth it. GCD is sadly here to stay in this expansion and every other, and regardless how they tweak it, they already stated they're not removing GCD from offensive abilities. So disappointed with BFA, just like many others who have left solely in the expansion, blah, blah, blah. Right, so one at a time there. In terms of the Azeroth system, it is true they do not know what they're doing with it. They really didn't think it all through. They did not have a good plan for Azeroth. And yes, they're making some improvements in terms of how we acquire it, and with the extra ring as well on the new Azeroth pieces. But ultimately, which will be better, but they still don't really know what they're doing with it. It's all starting to get a bit unravelled, I think. I mean, the Azeroth system, I still say, is there for the same purpose that artifacts were in the previous expansion. It's there for something to keep us working on a thing and wanting us to log in each week. That's what it's there for. Because otherwise, there's nothing wrong with having the Azeroth system without the need to collect artifact power. You know, the artifact power, it's there to... They need artifact power as a way to have us doing content each week. And that's the outlet for it in this expansion. But in terms of the GCD, it says, sadly here to say, it says they've already said they're not removing it from offensive abilities. They shouldn't remove it from offensive abilities. That's not the issue with GCD. It should never be on offensive abilities. The whole purpose of a GCD is to stop you firing off every spell all at once and killing someone. That's its purpose. It exists simply to make you queue up abilities. What should be off the GCD are utility abilities. Okay? You know, movement speed defensive should definitely be off the global cooldown. And they have taken it off the global cooldown for many, movement speed and defensive abilities. Just not all of them. It's like some classes get it off, some classes get some off and some not. Some classes get all of them on, and it's ridiculous. There's no consistency to it. In terms of, if you mean by offensive cooldowns, DPS cooldowns, well, that's a different matter. And yes, they should be off. I mean, the argument for putting them on was, oh, well, some classes have several offensive cooldowns and we didn't want them chaining them all together. It says, well, don't give them all those offensive cooldowns then. Give everyone one offensive cooldown, tailor it to the particular theme of that class and leave it at that. That's their fault for giving them several ones. And this is the problem they do. They identify a problem and then they apply a solution that makes no sense. The solution they apply... It's literally the using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. That's what it's like doing. Instead of taking care of the little thing that is the perceived problem, they cause a whole raft of other problems with it because they apply it to a much wider area. But anyway, so it says you're disappointed with BFA just like many others who left early in the expansion. No change will redeem it. Sadly, the next expansion won't be any better, probably worse. Well, in terms of general philosophy, if they get away with it, in other words, if the next expansion... Well, I don't actually know, because I suppose the next expansion, they may have been chastened by the massive loss of subs, but they still shifted lots of units of BFA. I still think the thing they're going to take from BFA is, if we can hype the hell out of the next expansion, and we can get them to pre-order it half a year in advance. And we can do what we like. Bring it out and then fix it as the expansion goes on. I mean, this really started in Legion. Even though Legion was well received, the seeds of this were sown in Legion in that they got away with carrying on with class development throughout the expansion. So they basically already laid the seeds for the fact that they can get away with bringing something out in an unfinished state, which Blizzard never used to do, and keep just promise fixes. As long as they keep throwing a few breadcrumbs, as long as every now and then there are a few fixes that come in, that way the people who benefit from those fixes go, oh yeah, they're fixing it, and then they get to go, calm down to everyone else, don't worry, look, they're fixing it, they've already done this. And then for everyone else who doesn't benefit from those fixes, they get to see that some fixes are coming. So maybe their fixes are the next lot. And then sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Anyway. Right, next one. It says, so I personally won't be playing Classic. It's just not for me. I still remember all the bad bits that came along with the good, and it's enough to dissuade me from doing it. Now that said, I do miss a lot from Classic WoW. Or at least what it says from BC on when you joined. I really miss the older version of Sunken Temple and Scholar Manse. Yes, Scholar Manse was my favourite dungeon until they ruined it. Lucky enough to play them once or twice when I out-leveled them. In fact, I can still remember how many Scholar Manse runs it took for me to get my Lightforge helm. 42. It's an easy number to remember because it's the same number as, meaning of life. But yeah, I ran it so many times, but I actually loved it every time. By the time I'd finished vanilla, I reckon I would have run it 100 plus times. Loved it. Anyway, and while you can imagine that getting them to pop in your LFG when you were leveling would likely make you feel like you do when you see BRD pop up. So the old Scholarmans, you wouldn't want that popping up in Looking for Dungeon. I have no issue with the new Scholarmans, by the way, in terms of that. But they shouldn't have got rid of the old Scholarmans. That's the thing. But I don't think, and person just said here, don't think they should have been removed. You loved it if, when you walk into the portal, you got prompts saying old on you. If there was a member of the Bronze Dragonflight standing outside, that would change it for you. They don't even need to do that. They can just do what they did with Karazhan, right? Karazhan, they changed. If they'd have got rid of the old Karazhan, I think there would have been blood on the streets of Blizzard HQ. But you still go into the old Karazhan. You can still go into the original Karazhan. You just have the new Karazhan. They put a different entrance. They could have done that with the Scholarmans as well. It's a big old building. They easily could have put a different entrance there. So one entrance for the original Scholarmans, another entrance for the other one. And let's face it, the new Scholarmans, the vast majority of people that go into the new Scholarmans do so with, signing up, queuing up and getting instantly transported there. So what difference does it make? But you could just create yourself a different entrance that would still put you in pretty much the same place, but just a different entrance. That's all you needed. These things you could do with Bronze Dragons as well, yeah, but I don't think there's any need to. I think they could have just done it with a slightly, two entrances, like that, slightly differently placed. But anyway, in terms of the classic thing, this is what a lot of people are going to feel. There are bad things about it, and let's just face it. It's not just that it was better in every way. It wasn't. There's been massive improvements to the game since vanilla. There are things I liked about it, but and I say I will play it, but I will play it largely for nostalgia. But there are things I enjoyed. I enjoyed the questing. I enjoyed a lot of other things to it as well. Some of the things I enjoyed about it won't be present. There's a lot of people thinking it's a fantasy. It won't be present. The way people will behave won't be entirely. Some of it was down to the way vanilla was, and that will still be there. Some of it was just down to the times. MMOs in general have changed massively over the course of World of Warcraft being out. Hugely, and World of Warcraft itself has changed some of those attitudes. There's much less of a social aspect to it now. And a lot of the people that play it won't engage as much as people did at the time. There'll be still a lot of people who will, but it'll be fewer. There'll be more convenience type things, just in terms of add-ons, as well as websites, fan sites that will be there to facilitate things. I think it's much more likely, for example, that people will join guilds, which is actually a good thing, to do dungeons. Because I don't think a lot of people would put up with spending hours just to do one dungeon. In terms of the time it takes to get the group together and all the rest of it. So I think it will be a very different experience to how it was, regardless of what they do. But for people who will try it out, they will see that it is not. If you were to just compare Vanilla WoW with World of Warcraft, the vast majority of people, not everyone because it's subjective, but the vast majority of people will conclude that the modern version of WoW is a superior game on balance. It's just that classic WoW, well, for a start, there's a load of stories in there that have been removed. That's my big issue with the 1 to 60 revamp. There's a load of stuff that the game taught you about the lore of Warcraft that's gone, obliterated. Which is why I took exception when Blizzard recently said that, there's 14 years worth of story development for a new player to enjoy. No, there isn't. There's 12 years because you got rid of the first 2 years. They've completely gone. They've been expunged. Gone. There's not a trace of them other than in the raids that are remaining, and not even all of the raids remain. And the problem is that the storyline that did exist in Anchorage as well as Molten Core, Blackwing Lair, those stories have also been removed because the stories themselves took place outside of the raids. They've all gone. It's all gone. So that part of it will be quite good. It'll be interesting for people to play through those, I think. So I think there might be a decent number play that didn't play at the time, but they will start to see that it's actually just not as good a game. Everything takes a lot longer. Everything, any task takes a lot longer. Warlocks will be pissed off gathering soul shards. Hunters will be pissed off running out of ammo, having to go back to wherever the hell. Everyone will get pissed off about having to carry around a reagents, then running out and then having to go and get more. Everyone will be pissed off going to a griffin to fly somewhere and go, oh, I've got this silver, where the hell? And then having to walk until level 40. People will get pissed off running down to the south of Stranglethorn Vale and then seeing some arsehole riding past you, but you're still only level 38. So 2 more levels to go before you can do the same. Anyway, but we will see. So it says next one, yes, now personal loot. And this is exactly what I said about personal loot. It says, I'm perhaps the only person playing marksmanship hunter in Mythic raids, and there's literally only one boss that drops anything I'll ever need in 8.0 content, and that's Zekvos. The rest just doesn't have anything I need, even Titan Forging. I mean, I imagine you mean from a weapon point of view. I don't know. But this is exactly the problem I said. Well, a number of problems with forced personal loot for Mythic raiding guilds, and one of them is this. If you are playing a class where the items you want, a lot of other people have them on their loot table, there's a decent chance that they'll drop and people won't need them at some point. They might need the first one, then they get another one, and they can trade it to you and all the rest of it. I mean, that doesn't become automatically straightforward because sometimes people will get an item which will be higher item level than they've got, but it's not an upgrade for them, so it still has to be destroyed. That's always disappointing. But this is a particular problem for hunt, and I said at the time, hunters have got the worst of it because their weapon is only a hunter weapon. So unless there's several hunters in your raiding roster, which there may be, sometimes there is, but a lot of times there's not. There's nothing particularly amazing about hunters. They're all right. They're always all right. Sometimes they're particularly decent. Aspect of the turtle came in useful a lot during the last expansion, but I'm not sure how much this expansion really. So, you can easily be the only hunter in your raid, is what I'm saying. So the only way you're going to get a weapon in that raid is if it drops for you. That's it. No one else is going to be able to trade it to you. And in terms of your armor, it's mail. So there's only you and shamans. Oh, just as well, shamans are doing all right. So there's loads of shamans. Oh, wait, hang on a minute. So, yeah, the hunters are the most buggered of anything. Because at least shamans, their weapon options will drop for others as well. And trinket and stuff like that. But for hunters, it's like, well, the trinkets, I suppose. And rings and all that sort of business. But in terms of the mail armor and the weapons, if you're the only hunter... And in your raid roster, there's not likely to be a lot of shaman. There might only be one. There might not be any at all. Then you are going to have a tough time of it. You are having a very tough time of it, and it just encourages a lot of waste. And people have said, and I think it's true, the reason they put the forced personal loot. I can understand putting forced personal loot in for like PuGs and stuff like that sort of content, but when it's in a guild group. There was no real reason for doing it other than it's just a way of it's all about extending the time it takes for people to be finished with content. They brought in Warforged to do that, but even with Warforged for people who were competing at a high rate of progress, they would still basically have everything Warforged or most things Warforged by the end of the tier. So then they did Titan Forging. Well, there's no chance of that. But then there comes a point where Mythic Raiders especially, who are very well aware of probability, will just think to themselves, well, the chances of getting, more pieces on this. So even though you've not effectively got BIS, because you could get everything Titanforged, they know that the chances are zero. So people will come to a point where they'll think it's as good as being in BIS gear. Because the chances of them getting upgrades at a certain point are slim to nil. So it's not really worth the effort. And again, it means people feel that they finished with it. Blizzard don't want us ever to feel that we're finished with the content. So then they did the forced personal loot, because that does exactly the same thing again. it means it takes longer for people to gear up. Because they needed a way. Titan Forging wasn't... It was doing what they wanted it to do. It was encouraging us to do content we might not ordinarily do because of the chance of an upgrade. But there was too much of it, so they had to reduce the chance of Titan Forging, or so they said. So I'm guessing at that point they thought to themselves, so we're going to need something else to compensate. We need a way of making it so it takes longer for people to get even their basic gear. And forced personal loot is one such way. But of course that can have a knock-on effect on certain classes, because if it's going to take you longer to gear up, that means your item level or quality of your gear is always behind others in your raid. That means you might not be able to perform as well, which is like, it's so unfair, really. You know, and they haven't turned anyone around over it. The forced personal loot for Mythic Plus raid guilds, that then they're not all suddenly, now that they've tried it for a tier or a raid, gone, oh yeah, it's actually all right. They're not at all. It's absolutely appalling. Next one, a couple on Mythic Plus. So it says, I've personally been to 2 Mythic raiding guilds in this expansion and see another interesting behaviour. People prefer pugging keys on looking for dungeon because randoms might have a higher IO score than their own guild is. Have I been unlucky and joined antisocial guilds, or are people not interested in creating relationships and learning together? If you're in Mythic, you've been in 2 Mythic raiding guilds, and people in those Mythic raiding guilds prefer to pug as compared to doing it in the guild, I worry about your guild. That's appalling. Mythic raiders should absolutely want to do Mythic Plus dungeons with... You always want to do it with people you know. The only reason why you might ever want to take a pug over someone you know is, you're alluding there, if you think the pug might be better. Because you've got better communication with people you know. You'll be using voice comms. Okay, there's a facility to use voice comms with a pug as well, but that's probably not going to go too well. People won't know each other's voices, stuff like that. Just simple things like knowing each other's voices and knowing the way you work together and communicate and stuff like that gives you a massive advantage when doing Mythic Plus dungeons, because you'll work much more efficiently. So if people think that a random has a better chance of letting them get that dungeon done efficiently than their own guild is, then they have a very dim view indeed of their own guild is. And if their view is actually accurate, then blimey, I'm going to guess these are guilds that have not done cutting edge, because that would be madness, absolute madness. Because I've known people that have pugged Mythic Plus dungeons in Mythic raids. If they've been wanting to do it at a time when there's not really been anyone on in the guild, that's fine. Or if you had to pug one person because there's not enough people need to do it. But your first port of call will always be to do it in the guild. Why wouldn't you? So I think, yes, you may have joined antisocial guilds, but I think you have been unlucky, because I think that's bizarre behaviour. Absolutely bizarre. Can't understand it myself. And then on to another one, also to do with IO. It says, I don't get why you seem to have a negative opinion about IO right after saying how much of a pain it is to form a decent group, and right before saying people should just find a guild with like-minded people or people of equal experience. That's what IO does for you. It actually doesn't. First of all, in that video, I wasn't actually expressing a negative view of IO, but I do have a negative view of IO. And it is this, right? So 2 different experiences. There's my BFA experience and my Legion experience. In my Legion experience, my Mythic Raiding experience, I was a Mythic Raider. You know, I could do Mythic Plus dungeons, high keys, blah, 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 blah. I wasn't that interested, but I could do them. And, you know, I was one of the first people to do a plus 15 Karazhan, for example. But anyway. Or which one was it? Can't remember. It's lower or upper. Who cares? Lower. And then that was when it was quite tough. But I did it with people in my guild. But every now and then, we'd have to pug someone. For the reasons I've just mentioned, you know, there'd be like 4 of us and we need another DPS. Well, let's pug someone then. Or sometimes we're still under the tank. But whatever, it would sometimes be 4 of us. We've tried to ask in guild, we've asked on Discord, and no one's up for doing it in the next like half an hour or so. So we go, right, let's just pug it. We get a pug in. A lot of those times, and the people who've organised these, yes, they used the IO score. A lot of those times we got someone in who had like seemingly impressive scores across the board. and they were utterly useless. They cost us so much time. They pulled extra packs. They got themselves killed. You know, they gave us a right nightmare. But here's the thing. We got through it because essentially we're 4 Mythic Raiders going through that dungeon. We're effectively carrying this person hard. We get to the end of it. What happens is they get, at the end of it, a way better time than they deserve for their own skill. And they get to pad their IO score again. So then the next time they go into a pug, the same thing happens. The same thing happens. Because the way the IO score is based on, you just need to get yourselves through decent times on all these dungeons. And if you keep plugging away of it, eventually, you know, you will get into groups like ours, where it was 4 Mythic Raiders in super good gear, blasting you through some at plus 15 in next to no time. We probably should have been better off doing it with just 4 people. I'm not saying all of them had a negative effect on the group. Sometimes it was still better than taking no one. But it gave us a way harder time than we otherwise should have had. But they're getting the score out of it. Because we're not going to kick them, are we? You know, we still take them. But they're doing way better. Whereas if you had 5 people at that person's level of skill, there's no way they'd get through the dungeon. So it artificially inflates some people's scores, particularly if they happen to play a class that's highly desirable, or a role that's highly desirable. Because, you know, a really good group who just need one other person will still get everyone through it. They'll just have a much tougher... Everyone will have to pick up on a hell of a lot of slack, that's all. And now my experience as in BFA, I'm perfectly capable of doing dungeons at Mythic Plus. You know, more than capable. I have 0 chance of getting into any pug. And the same actually was technically true at certain points in Legion as well. There were certain times when I said, well, I'm only going to do my plus 15 one for a week. I got eventually, when we no longer needed to do it for Artifact Power, and I got so sick of being forced to do it, I was like, I'm just doing 1. That's it. So at that time, I wouldn't have got in to a pug. You know, there's times when I've not been able to get into a heroic raid pug just to do a boss or something like that. Even though I've killed loads of bosses on Mythic in that same raid and done the heroics already. Couldn't get in. In fact, do you know what was actually hilarious? For Antorus, in the very... You know, they always say things like, oh, you must have ahead of the curve to get in there. Like from the second week, people will be insisting on ahead of the curve. I couldn't get into a pug in the first week when I had ahead of the curve. Because what had happened was I'd had to work late, particularly nights like Parents' Evening or something like that. So I got back. I'd only killed the last 4 bosses of the heroic Antorus. So I wanted to do the others for gear. Couldn't get into a pug. Could not get into a pug. Even though I had ahead of the curve. Couldn't get in. You know. I'd killed the last few bosses. The hardest bosses. Couldn't get in to do the others. You know, and I mean, that was just because Rhett. But, you know, it doesn't tell you who's good and who's not. Now, I understand why people would want the system, because it's like, well, if we just let any old random, at least it gives us a higher chance. At least we know that person has experienced it. So it gives you a better chance. And I understand that. Totally understand that. But to suggest that it's a system that means, yes, this person is good because they have this score, or this person is bad because they have this score, is completely wrong. There are lots of people that have a high score that are useless. There are lots of people who have a low score that are actually very good and can do it way better. Now, yes, you don't know that, but that's why I advise the guild. You find, if you want to do content, find a guild that does that content, like-minded players, and you will always do better. It is always better to do it in that guild. You know. So that's why I'm negative about it. It's inaccurate, and even when it works, it's still less effective than a guild. You know, the best it can ever be is not as good as a guild. Next one. Right, next one. So I was just largely joking, but it could be done. So we're talking about the smart NPCs they have in islands and where they may eventually go with these things. Obviously, we know the next stage is the smart effectively opposite faction player characters for the new, like, Arathi Basin type thing. But I sort of suggest, well, maybe in LFR, when you're waiting around for ages for someone, they the game just says, "Look, here, have some smart tanks or smart healers or something." So smart NPCs in LFR could be a problem. You have an NPC for 2 bosses and one-shot them both, then get a bad real tank and end up with the group kicking them to get their NPC back. This will lower the skill base of the players as they won't have a chance to learn and improve. 2 raid tiers down the line, you just have DPS raid groups. Well, some people wouldn't mind that, but in terms of that, I mean, that really is an issue with the kicking, isn't it? Because I have a bit of an issue with the way the game allows people to kick maliciously. I think there needs to be more conditions that exist before kicks are allowed. And I don't think people should just be able to kick for whatever reason. You know, I think this is ultimately a problem with the kick. You know, people should basically have to be AFK or something like that to be kicked. And I can understand when someone's making a right proper arse of it, then you kick them. But then there ought to be at least a wipe before you're allowed to kick people on a particular boss. So that's where the issue is. I think the issue is with the nature of kicking people. Also, I can't imagine that a smart tank is going to be better than you know, a player tank that's put any effort in. I mean, when you're talking about someone who's a bad real tank, you're talking about someone who hasn't put any effort into it. You know, if someone hasn't even read the journal to see how they should do the fight, because it does give them quite a lot of information. If they haven't even done that, then don't they deserve to be kicked? I mean, the whole purpose of LFR is it's supposed to be much easier version, but it's still supposed to be raiding, and you're still supposed to have a certain level of preparation for raiding. We don't expect people to have gone on and read up guides or anything like that. I mean, who the hell does LFR guides anyway? But we don't expect that sort of thing. But you expect them to at least have read the journal, to have gone in with as much understanding as they reasonably can, without access. I'm not saying with third-party sites, but you know, as much effort as they can. And if they can't even do that, and tanking in LFR is not the most difficult skill, is it? Let's be honest. LFR tanking is very much like vanilla tanking was in many ways. It's just stand the boss in a particular place, and you know, you might have to arrange a taunt swap with another player, and that's what they find. That's usually where you end up with a bad tank situation, where they don't taunt properly. Either they're either constantly taunting, and so they end up getting, because the whole purpose of having 2 tanks, mostly the most crude way that Blizzard manage this is to have debuffs appear on a tank to the point where it keeps stacking up, and it'll get to a point where you're just going to be one shot. So what you do is you get as many stacks as is reasonably expected, and then the other tank will taunt off you. So while the first tank's stacks wear off, and then the second tank, their stacks build up, and you arrange it like that. Now, when tanks can't even manage that, they're either constantly taunting, so they get all the debuffs on them and then they die, or they never taunt it. They just say, well, you know, I'll just stay here. And then the first tank is getting all these stacks now. I think, Jesus Christ. And so, you know, they end up dying. That's like the most difficult thing a tank ever has to do. You know, stand the boss in the right place. If there's 2 of them and they need cleaving, then make sure you're together. If there's a certain point where they mustn't be together, then move them away. And then swap at certain things if it's on one boss and there's like stacks of something. That's all there is. If people can't go in and prepare for that, I don't think they deserve to be in. And if they prefer just to go in as a DPS and where it's easy to be carried, then they should just do that. Sorry. Next one, it says, islands are pretty awesome under certain conditions. Mythic level islands, we all guildmates, we had a blast, and they can be somewhat of a decent challenge to win. Well, I mean, this is my argument with it as well. I think islands themselves are not fun content in themselves. They're not fun in PuGs. With your guilds, they are, but then almost anything can be fun when you're doing it with people you know. I mean, I remember... Are we going back to my first year? I think we're going back to my first year in WoW. Yes, we are. So, which would have been 2005, not 2004. And the first New Year's, I remember, and this was in like my first proper raiding guild, and there was a few of us who weren't going out for New Year's Eve. And so we just went online and we just went and did some stuff. Like I remember us doing Scholarmans, for example, 5-man Scholarmans. And we were drinking while we were doing it as well, so we were getting into a right mess and just having a good laugh, And this is us as raiders going and just doing a dungeon together. Like, I used to do dungeons even after I was a raider, but mostly that was I deliberately pug them to try and scout out talent. This is us as a group within the guild, so we're not going to get anything out of it. There was no gear for us there. We'd done all the quests already. I suppose with Scholarmancy, there's some Argent Dawn rep we could be getting. But at the time, we didn't necessarily know that we really needed it. Because Shoulder Enchants were already out from Zul'Gurub. That was one of the things it did give you if you got high enough. Nice Tabard, yeah, fine. But we didn't know that at some point with Naxxramas, we'd get to go in, get a tune cheaper if we had a higher rep valued. But I liked it so much, I eventually got to Exalted anyway, with Argent Dawn. So you're just having a laugh. But that's the thing. If you're doing it with people and you enjoy spending time with, you will enjoy any content. And yeah, islands, I think, are enjoyable when you do it with people you know. I totally agree. The reason I don't do islands is because there aren't people I know that want to do them. So I just don't. And I don't stay on and deliberately ask to do it because it's not content I want to do. So I don't want to ask other people to make a group and do it with them, even though they might. If anyone was about and said, we need one more person for islands and I was free, I would go in because why not? But I wouldn't pug them. So that's the thing. But yeah, I think any content in the game, if you're doing it with people you enjoy being with and grouping with, then you will have a good time with anything. Nearly there. Got two more, I think. Right, next one. It says, I have a question for you. If Blizzard removed LFR and replaced it with a 5-man raiding instance, same loot as it is now, would that make it more viable and fun? What are my thoughts on this? It might. The main thing I would have against it is it diminishes the epicness of it. Now, I know there's nothing particularly epic about LFR, but in terms of the encounter, you're supposed to be taking on the toughest villain type NPCs in the game, and you're going in with like an army of heroes, effectively. I mean, I didn't like it when they went from 40-man to 25-man. I sort of understand that there were some good reasons for doing so, but it just to me felt less epic. And then when they went down from 25-man to 20-man, same thing. It all just got less epic. So if you're tackling on like these super powerful NPCs that are there in raids because only a raid of heroes is going to be able to take them on, then to have a 5-man version of it seems disappointing from a spectacle point of view. From a practical point of view, I think it would be way better. It'd be way better for a few reasons. One, I think the people actually engage in it would find it more enjoyable just to sign up as if it were a dungeon and just do it 5-man, and that would be okay. It would be more useful because then I know there's a bit of an issue at the moment of people being annoyed that people think LFR is raiding. Well, it is raiding. It is actually raiding. It's not, challenging, because it depends. Like, it's raiding in the literal sense, in that a raid is anything that's got more than 5 people in the group. You've got like 25 people, so it's a raid. However, there's no challenge to it, and the whole point of a raid is it's supposed to be that high level of challenge in the PvE part of the game, and that's completely absent. And so it, and so I know that there are people that go, well, you shouldn't really consider LFR raiding from that point of view, and this would then stop it because it would no longer be raiding. But it's and then when it comes to giving the same items, now I can't remember exactly what the item level is, but then there'd be obvious parallels between the difficulty of it and the equivalent Mythic Plus dungeon that would give you the same item level of gear. And people would probably point out that whatever that Mythic Plus key is, and I don't know offhand, I should have looked it up beforehand, is way more difficult than this. So you'd then have people drawing comparisons between that LFR content and the equivalent Mythic Plus dungeon content. And it probably wouldn't stack up favourably even then. And then, of course, from Blizzard's point of view, they would have to majorly adapt the fights, because some of those fights, even though there's not really much in terms of mechanics, sometimes there's enough mechanics that you need well, 2 tanks for a start. In a dungeon, it's not going to have 2 tanks. So oh hell, I've got rid of it. You'd have to, at the very least, get rid of those mechanics, which you could do that. And then the other thing is, sometimes I think, but yeah, you'd have to do a lot more designing of the LFR part of it. And then the other thing is, some people will see that although you can go into LFR and learn nothing, that's perfectly true. You can also go into LFR and learn something if you want to. If you're thinking to yourself, right, I'm a tank here, but I don't want to go into normal, and without having any idea. So I'll do it on LFR and at least practice those mechanics. And then all they need to do in the normal is, instead of learning all the mechanics, they've already familiar with some from LFR, and it's just like 1 or 2 extra for normal then. And then the benefit of doing the normal is that it's 1 or 2 extra for the heroic, and so on. They can keep doing it like that. So I don't think it would be viable, even though there are some things to be said for it. But the bottom line is, certainly Blizzard would not do it, because they just view it as another difficulty of raiding for a very casual player, and it will stay for that reason. And on to the final one. Just a nice simple one. It says, are we certain that development on Wrath of the Potato People, it's actually Revenge of the Potato People, but for those who have not been watching these sort of videos, that is my working title for the next expansion, because we don't know what it actually is yet. So I just call it Revenge of the Potato People. Are we certain that development on the next expansion didn't start in Legion, or that development on the expansion after hasn't already started? Mop and Cat were pretty ambitious too. Not sure high quality expansions are completely off the table. Yes, we are sure. Blizzard have said so, several times quite clearly. And I know they lie occasionally, but I don't just randomly accuse them of lying. I only accuse them of lying when I know they're lying. If they contradict themselves or something like that, something like that. I don't, if there's no reason for them to lie about a thing, then I don't accuse them of lying. I take everything they say to be factually true, unless I have a reason to believe otherwise. So what they said is in terms of what they said, we know that they started developing Warlords of Draenor and Legion at the same time as each other, because they wanted to do a process of developing 2 expansions in parallel. One would come out first, and then the next one. So you've always got 2 expansions being worked on, the next one and the one after. Now, that process was abandoned fairly quickly, because this was also part of the bringing out an expansion every year, which was never going to work. And I don't think that was the developer's idea either. That was, that's not something a developer would ever want to do. That will have come up from on high. And then they've eventually realised it ain't going to work, so they've abandoned it. So Legion and WoD were developed in parallel at the same time. Then WoD came out. The reason WoD came out is it was supposed to come out to coincide with the Warcraft movie. But then the Warcraft movie got put back, but they'd already committed to WoD being the next one. So they were stuck with it. And then the movie actually came out during Legion. But anyway, so then WoD came out. At which point, as that developed on, they'd already basically abandoned this notion of doing them in parallel. So at that point, people were working on Legion. Not Legion and BFA, just Legion. And then WoD became such a disaster, and they thought, hang on, Legion might also go badly, we can't afford this. So they just cut the cord on WoD. They just cut it, cut their losses, and decided to put loads and loads of resources into Legion. So Legion had not only more time than any other expansion, but more developers, because they'd massively increased the development team to be able to do these 2 things in parallel. But now they're just doing one. And then Legion came out, and then they started working on BFA. How do we know? Because they told us they did. They told us that's when they started working on BFA. And then, BFA has now come out. So this is the point at which they're now working on the next expansion. They haven't specifically said that, but they have specifically said that we start working on expansion when the previous one has just come out. So, and they said that quite recently, this year. So, yeah, that we do know that. And as I say, my issue, again, for people who have been watching other videos I've talked about on the same subject, is the situation we find ourselves with BFA is, so they've planned, obviously some developers have to carry on working on BFA. There's more content to come out, and the class designers obviously have to do on that. But that's fine. Class designers never do any work on the next expansion until the current expansion is finished. They do zero work on it. The class designers are always working on the current expansion. All right? Until the current expansion's content is finished. But in terms of other developers, the idea is that a lot of them then go and work on the new project. But with BFA, it's in such an unfinished state, some of which was always planned, it's quite clear, but some of which they've been genuinely taken aback. It's so poorly planned. So now you've got developers that are supposed to be working on BFA having to develop the things for BFA that were already planned. But then there's things that need fixing. That also takes developers to do. So they have two choices. Either they cut content from BFA. Do they really want to do that and risk parallels being drawn with WOD? Or you take developers off Revenge of the Potato People to get BFA up to speed, and then when you've finished, put them back. But given that they've already underestimated, their plans effectively for BFA, they may also be underestimating how long it will take to get get it fixed, basically, to get it all patched up. So they may think, oh, it'll probably just be 3 months. We'll be taking these people off that project. It may end up being 6 months or 9 months or a year. And for every day that those developers are not working on Revenge of the Potato People, that means Revenge of the Potato People is also getting behind. And remember, it's the same people, essentially, who are in charge of all these development systems. The only new person, senior person to the team, as far as I know, is Brian Hilinka, but he's into the class team, which is always the current one anyway. So in terms of what they're planning for the next expansion already and working on, it's teams that, as far as I know, the leadership has not changed on. So those same leaders that have underestimated things for BFA are very likely underestimating those same, unless they've learnt lessons, which is possible. You'd like to think so. So the consequence either is we end up with BFA having content cut, or we end up with the next expansion having content cut. There really is no other way around it. The only third way is getting a load more developers in. Now, Ian Hazakostas has basically said that's what he wants, but it ain't what he's got. He's got his team, and that's it. And to be honest with you, if I was going to be someone trying to go and saying I want more developments for my team, and you've just lost a load of money because of a load of lost subs, which is still, not known for, it's allegedly, but we all sort of think it's true. You're going to have a harder time justifying it. I mean, you can try and justify it, and well, the reason we lost those loads is because we didn't have enough developers. But at the same time, they've got more developers than they've ever had for previous expansions. So I think they take a dim view of that. So I think, I think realistically, either BFA has content cut or the next one has content cut. So there you go. That's me done for this week. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to click the like button, comment down below, especially if you know where the mailbox is this week. Remember, we need the specific place as well as the zone. And until next time, I'll see you later.